Translation theory is based on possibility to discover the meaning of a text from its source language and reproduce it in the target language. Translation studies has emerged as a discipline of studies in late 1970s. It has associated itself with comparative literature, cultural studies and interdisciplinary studies to deal with various dimensions. This is why cultural turn in translation and machine translation both have become relevant in translation studies. Intersectionalist of gender and language plays a vital role in the process of translation and also mentioning about common perception of women referring as per dictionary meaning.
A good point of departure would be a dictionary. A woman, it says in Collins-Cobbold, is an adult human being in a more recent definition, which is at least more politically correct than earlier ones which talked about her reproductive capacity. Whereas mankind, that is humanity as a whole, is the most common definition of man. Man, taken in its absolute sense, is always also laudatory, praiseworthy, and we hear, be a man. But rarely do we hear, be a woman. That is never said, except as chastisement for daring to be different from what is expected of a woman. By extension, and I'm sure in most Indian languages, as I'm sure even in Hindi, for example, expressions such as ja chudi pen le is said to signify, is said to someone whom the speaker thinks is too scared to act. And therefore, like a woman, the expression is a negative trope. That person is too much of a coward to do anything. So the woman is considered to be always passive, cowardly, and very inactive. It is, of course, a moot point whether language affects thought and culture of a given society. As Marina Jagello, the French linguist, states, language is to a large extent a cultural mirror that fixes symbolic representation and is an echo of prejudices and stereotypes, while at the same time it feeds and upholds them. The question that begs to be asked at this juncture is therefore, who has the power to represent, to produce these symbols, and in whose interest does this control lie? The answer seems patently obvious. Language, cultural organizations, all representations humanity has of itself and other artifacts are mainly determined by the gaze of men and imposed by them. It is they who define the place of women, assigning them a secondary place and also keeping them in their place. This passivity is further strengthened with expressions, especially in English, like a man takes a wife, a woman gets married. Women undergo the actions carried out by men, but never accede to actions themselves. In the Hindu context also, we always hear a woman is given as Kanya Dhan, an object given by the father to the husband. All such expressions denote the active participation of the boy and the passive submission of the girl. This derogatory attitude is not a case in isolation, as we can see if we take any pair of male and female words, as we have seen, and the very adjectives derived also from man and woman are very, very significant. For example, in a weak and emotional way, or rather looks like a woman in some way, and it says, used, showing disapproval. And thus synonyms given, the synonyms given are effeminate or womanly, which is again shows what a woman's character should be, and then, or rather, what is suitable for a woman. That is, there is an order saying, behave like this, don't do anything else. Thus, dictionaries show, of course, the usage of these terms with perhaps more circumspection than earlier, but they do prescribe to us what is approved and what is not. By contrast, as I said, this adjective you can see. Therefore, Marina Jagello says, dictionaries have an important role in fixating and preserving not only languages, but also mentalities and ideologies. And she wonders whether we should burn all dictionaries, and cites Victor Hugo, who said, each revolution should be accompanied by a reform of dictionaries. As one more example of sexism in language, let us turn our attention to the generic pronoun he in English, used as the norm, with, so to say, unmarked terms such as professor. And you have this example, when a professor has completed his correction, he may submit the grades at the office, because this is a grammatically correct sentence in English, and meant to cover everybody, but you will always find when, and they have done tests to prove that the mental image is always one of a male, never that of a woman professor. Or consider the honorific titles, doctor, professor, and you will find that if it is a doctor, everywhere as a doctor, as a medical doctor, you'll find Mrs. And I still get letters addressed to me as professor, within brackets, Mrs. So-and-so. What is this? This is used to sort of reinforce the stereotypical gender coding of professions, wherein engineers, doctors, pilots, etc. are male, and secretaries, nurses seen as female occupations. The question has not yet been resolved, as solutions for finding a gender-neutral term vary according to personal ideology. While some want the female form to be the norm, others want the male to be used as an unmarked term, while some others ask for new neutral terms to be coined. That is what we should do. In the 19th century itself, the German grammarian, he said things named by masculine nouns they come earlier, they are larger, firmer, more inflexible, quicker, active, more movable, creative. But those that were feminine came later, smaller, softer, quieter, suffering, passive, receptive. So you have Daphne du Maurier's novel I took up, which is Rebecca, and there's a sentence, the same cook, I suppose, Maxim. And in French, the cook is translated as female, and in German, it comes as male. And the same way you go to Bernard Shaw's Back to Methuselah, and he talks about his secretaries. The French and English, in this French and German, I'm sorry, both of them use the male, because this is the expectation of what is possibly in their own culture, who are the people who will do these jobs. So that is what is very, very interesting, and which is why this is called by Susan de Ludbinia Harwood as he-man language. It's very sexist. It's very, well, male-oriented. Whereas the third person, and you can say out here, the third person plural in French, you have the word il, that is they, which is masculine, male, plural, and you also have elle, which is a feminine plural. But if there are a series of objects with 20 objects in female, but one object which may be just a cat, which is masculine, in French, it has to be il. That is the grammatical rule my post-students had to deal with. Yes, that's how it is, but which is why you have find, as I said, cited Harwood, Ludbinia Harwood, she says this is the logic of il, that is of the he. That is why it is so illogical. Okay? So that's why she says this is therefore a very man-made language. It's not a neutral term, it's man-made language, very patriarchal in nature. And what happens is this man-made language is also labeled as an androlect, as you can see out there. If women have to express themselves, therefore, they are forced to translate this patriarchal code. And this code and this experience, their viewpoints, are all areas of experience which have to be translated into this he-man language. And leading many women writers, therefore, to use the term translation to describe their work. Why? As Barbara Godard puts it, translation in its figurative meanings of transcoding and transforming is a topos in feminist discourse used by women writers to evoke the difficulty of breaking out of silence in order to communicate new insights into women's experiences and their relation to language.
Many women in the field of translation have found out that metaphors that describe women experiences have been lost to male domination of all aspects of language. Men have the power to represent and produce these symbols, and they serve their interest. It seems the languages and cultural organizations, humanity itself, are determined by the male gaze. This patriarchal attitude embedded deeply inside cultures prevents women from taking their rightful place. It is they who assign a secondary place to the women to put them in their place.
I'm a translation because I'm a woman. I'm a translation because I am bilingual. And bilingual also is very interesting because in Canada, she's a Canadian feminist. In Canada, there are, of course, the presence of two languages, English and French, and English is the dominant language over French. So women's writing per se is, as Patricia Smart puts it very aptly, writing takes place in the house of the father because it's a patriarchal code. And which is why you have Hélène Cixous, the French feminist, who says women's liberation starts with and through language. Okay? The metaphor of translation is not just with reference to translating a patriarchal code. Much like translations, women too can be betrayed, transformed, manhandled. Both are denied access to authority, as I said, the translator and the author. So authority, you have that. This parallel with translation brings us to the core of our study, the secondary status of translations and by extension, the translators themselves. And the language used to describe translation are normally metaphoric, as Antoine Berman states, translation can only be defined. You can say it's not the person, it's the portrait, it's not the gallery, it's a reproduction of paintings, it's not the original. It's like wanting to translate Pushkin, it's like trying to make a sculpture. Lawrence Venuti has clearly underscored this as translation is defined as a second-order representation. Only the foreign text can be original, an authentic copy, true to the author's personality or intention, whereas the translation is derivative, fake, potentially a false copy. If the very act of translation is one of playing second fiddle, what then is the role of the translator? It is a life without recognition, without glory, without absolutely no status. And Sir John Denham, the 17th century translator, had to say, such is our pride, our folly, our fate. Or Naida, who says that the translation may be like a woman in man's clothing. Hence, translations try to imitate the original, viewed in masculine terms, and try to pass themselves off as the originals by wearing men's clothing or wearing the pants. The right to wear the pants always remain with the men, the originals. Okay? And Sherry Simon has, of course, said, if metaphor is to be considered proto-theoretical language, then the language of translation theory has indeed been profoundly marked by gender. The binary oppositions of author, translator, original translation, source language, target language have all been perceived in sexual terms. And of course, the most classic example of this is translation being like a woman who, if beautiful, is always unfaithful. In French, la belle infidèle. And this, of course, unfortunately, is a French person who said it in the 17th century itself. And of course, as everybody has pointed out, the word translation is feminine gender, grammatical gender, and therefore woman being feminine sexually, it sort of captures a cultural complicity between grammatical gender and a social being. As Laurie Chamberlain has said it, it's a cultural complicity. For les belles infidèles, that is the beautiful, unfaithful, fidelity is defined by an implicit contract between translation as women and the original as husband, father, or author. She points out that it is not legal to publish translations without entering into a contract with the author, much like the marriage contract, before announcing the birth of the translation, so as to ensure the paternity of the work. If the child is the production of the father, reproduced by the mother, the value of production always remains with the author, as is the case with of the translation. And the paternity legitimizes the reproduced child, that is the translation. If the translator and author thus form a couple, the question of fidelity can never be far behind. It's always fidelity. Thus, the very concept of language is seen in feminized terms, marrying grammatical gender and rhetorical image, and it is to be found in other theoreticians' statements as well. This is in terms of struggle for authority, for paternity, for copyright, where the rights remain with the original, seen in terms of paternity and reproduction. The translation is seen in feminized terms of secondary importance. This is so because translation tries to take the place of the original and this position of authority and the power accorded normally only to the original. This lexicon of sexual difference and sexist perception, as it defines translation, clearly shows the status of both women and translations. To escape this bind, it is high time that women write their own metaphors of cultural production, because they're both concerned by the way secondariness comes to be defined and canonized. Both are tools for a critical understanding of difference as it is represented in language. And this common concern, also, as she said, grew up around the same time, and the translation studies through the 70s closely parallels the development of feminist theory, which has obviously led to the practice of what is now termed feminist translation, which you've all seen in the concept note. Therefore, you can say feminist translation thus aims to identify and criticize that which relegates both women and translation to the lowest rank in life and in literature. It attempts to examine and question the notion of authority and patriarchy in translation practices and translated texts from the point of view of feminism. And as Louise von Flotow has therefore defined it, it's an approach to translation that has appropriated many of the techniques that underlie the writing it translates. This is an offshoot of experimental Quebec women writers, Nicole Brossard and so many others, and therefore you can call it a tributary of Quebec feminist writers' experimental writings. And as this, its aim is to make women appear in language and in society by the very practice it follows. With this objective, the feminist translations hope to fulfill several tasks. One, by looking at how women's place has been translated in various texts, how women writers have been translated, and especially how women writers who are feminists can be translated. Therefore, correcting translations, that is, changing, setting right the translations already done, is to project the presence of women who have been hidden away and silenced by the betrayal of the translators, by the unfaithful translators. And the writing of this translated text started, in fact, with the Bible itself, as I think all of you in English studies especially have done a lot of that, I'm sure, whose translations have been accused of effacing women in positions of power, replacing them with the generic masculine, marking the beginning of the Christian religion. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, whom you all must have read, was the first to undertake the rewriting of the Bible, as the English version, and I quote, does not exalt or dignify women. And the Women's Bible, published in 1895, shocked and scandalized the Western world. This, in turn, was later, of course, criticized as being a white, Anglo-Saxon, Anglo-American expression, that this Bible did not fulfill everybody's viewpoint, which in turn has led to various recent versions of the Bible depending on the political ideologies informing the enterprise. In French too, and you have the example where there are female deities who have all been translated into the masculine gender to be translated as God. Therefore, you have not only changed and been very unfaithful to the original, what has happened is to the position of women in power. And this is, as Katie Metzai says, is a classic case of erasure of women from language, where it is relegation of women not merely to other object, but to silence and oblivion. So the women are all removed from the various examples of women in the Bible, in the Old Testament especially. Even if there have not been many feminist interpretations of the Bible or other religious texts we can talk of here, the point to note is the various changes effected in translation that led to establishment of religious dogmas which get established as tradition. And I think one of the most classic examples is the Hebrew Bible, where the virgin is actually said as a young girl. But whereas in the English and in other European languages, it has been translated into a virgin, which has led to a whole kind of belief system, which is very different from the original, which just mentions young girl. But the translation has changed the whole faith in Christianity. Which, of course, brings us to the next point of how women writers have been translated. If these examples are from religious texts, we have two, and everybody has been quoting Simone de Beauvoir today. So let me also quote from her book, The Second Sex, by the very famous Professor Howard Parsley. The first translation, there's a second one which has come out, and you realize 10% of the book is missing. Almost one half of a chapter is gone, with the names of 78 women in history completely left out. And these deletions strongly undermine de Beauvoir's analysis of the development of suffragette movements and the rise of socialist feminism. She is thus translated into a woman writing in an unsubstantiated void. All this just to reduce printing costs and sale prices. And if you can look at, and I think all of you now in here are very well equipped to deal and look at the Hindi translation of The Second Sex by Prabha Khaitan, and she criticizes Parsley's translation, but she herself carries out an enormous number of omissions. And therefore, the characteristics of feminist translation is laying the cards on the table, meaning you say exactly what you're doing, there is no other thing, there's no hidden agenda, it does not hide behind any claims to being universal, a universal practice, and it's claims very clearly the fidelity is to one's own ideology.